There is a very specific moment in a human life when you are not actively searching for anything, not asking big questions, not waiting for a sign, and yet a signal reaches you at exactly the right time. A video appears, a sentence lands, a melody passes through, and in that moment, with absolute clarity, not through logic, but through a quiet certainty that something inside you has shifted state. Not the feeling of trying harder, not a temporary burst of motivation, but a deep and still knowing that cannot be reversed, as if the reality around you has subtly changed the way it arranges its pieces to prepare you for another chapter. This is not a rare experience, yet very few people recognize it while it is happening, because it is not loud, not dramatic, and does not come with obvious signs. Most people dismiss it as a passing emotion, a coincidence, or simply an algorithm. But in the language of quantum keys, this is the moment your inner field becomes stable enough to receive feedback, clear enough to be read, quiet enough for the signal to enter. You did not find this video. Your system reached a state where this signal could reach you without distortion. What matters most is understanding that signals like this do not appear when the mind is chaotic, when the nervous system is still oscillating between anxiety, control, and desire. Reality does not respond to tension, it responds to stability. And the moment you feel something shifting very quietly inside you is the sign that coherence has begun to form. Coherence is not excitement, it is alignment. It is the moment your unconscious, your nervous system, and the way you exist in life begin moving in the same rhythm. When that happens, the observer within you stops wandering, stops searching, stops clinging, and begins to anchor. Anchoring does not mean standing still, it means becoming readable. A system can only be responded to when it is consistent enough to not disrupt its own signal. This moment is not the beginning of action, it is the beginning of being guided. Many people confuse change with movement. They believe that if no action has been taken, no decision made, no direction chosen, then nothing has happened. But in truth, every deep transformation begins at a very quiet point, where no new behavior appears, yet the internal structure has already changed. Like the surface of a lake before the current shifts, it may look calm, but the pressure underneath has already altered. When you touch this signal, when you pause long enough to feel it, instead of rushing to explain it, your field begins to shift from reaction to reception. This is the core principle quantum keys always points to. Reality does not choose people, it responds to states. No one is specially selected. Only systems that reach enough stability receive precise feedback. This explains why the same video, the same message, touches some people deeply while others pass by unaffected. It is not the content that differs, it is the receiving field. When the inner system is fragmented, when life is lived in constant low-level tension, control, and comparison, signals pass through without leaving a trace. But when you have gone far enough into silence, when old reactions grow tired, when old roles can no longer hold energy, the inner field naturally reduces noise, and in that state, new signals can enter. No persuasion is needed, no promises, no stimulation. You do not need to believe, you only need to recognize. Recognize that this vague yet certain feeling does not come from outside. It is the feedback of a system that has reached a new threshold. This is why quantum keys does not speak of belief, desire, or asking the universe. We speak of state, because when the state changes, response becomes inevitable. And if you are here, reading or listening to these words, it means something deep within you has stopped resisting. Not because you understand everything, but because you are calm enough to not need immediate understanding. This is the true gateway of a comeback. Not the return of image, status, or results, but the return of the capacity to be guided. When the observer no longer circles endlessly searching for answers, but stays still long enough for reality to speak back, this moment is fragile. If you rush to label it, explain it, or turn it into a story to tell others, the noise returns. But if you simply observe, if you quietly acknowledge that something small yet real is shifting, coherence will continue to reinforce itself. And from there, everything else follows, not because you pull it toward you, but because your system has entered a rhythm that reality can move with. This is the beginning. No ritual, no declaration, no promise, only a very quiet truth. The signal reached you because you were ready to be reached. And from this moment on, you are no longer searching for signs. You are slowly becoming what reality responds to. After the moment the signal reaches you, nothing outside changes immediately. Life continues at its old rhythm. Work carries on. The people around you remain the same. Yet inside, a very subtle misalignment appears. You begin to feel that what once felt familiar no longer fits, not because it is wrong, but because it can no longer keep pace with the new state that is quietly forming. This is when coherence begins to reveal itself, not as excitement, but as an unusual stillness. You are less easily pulled away. Stimuli that once triggered strong reactions now feel slightly more distant. It is not that you have overcome everything, but that your inner system is adjusting itself to find a new point of balance. Coherence always begins in silence because any deep restructuring requires noise to settle before a new order can emerge. When a system is too loud, it cannot synchronize itself. And when you have moved through enough exhaustion, enough disappointment, enough cycles that no longer carry meaning, the system naturally begins to lower its reactive amplitude. This is not giving up, it is intelligent fatigue. You stop trying to understand everything immediately. You stop forcing yourself to have answers. And it is precisely within that space that coherence begins to appear. Coherence is not control, it is consistency. It is the moment when thought, emotion, and behavior no longer pull in separate directions. Before, you might have thought one thing, felt another, and acted in a way that had little connection to either. That fragmentation created noise, and in noise, no precise feedback can arrive. But when coherence forms, even in its most fragile stage, you begin to sense a gentle alignment. You may not feel happier, but you feel clearer. Clear in the sense that something no longer needs to be carried. Clear in the realization that many past efforts were simply ways of avoiding silence. Coherence does not ask you to do more, it asks you to subtract. Fewer reactions, fewer explanations, less effort to hold together what has already begun to crack. This is why this phase is often mistaken for emptiness. People assume that when strong motivation fades and emotional highs disappear, something must be wrong. In reality, this is when the system is reorganizing itself. Like an instrument being tuned, there are moments when no sound emerges, not because it is broken, but because it is being brought back into proper frequency. You may begin to feel less interested in familiar conversations, not because you have grown cold, but because you no longer have the energy to sustain exchanges that exist only on the surface. You may also feel more tired, not because you are weaker, but because your nervous system is learning how to exit a prolonged state of vigilance. Coherence requires energy to form, and that energy comes from stopping the waste created by unnecessary reactions. During this phase, the observer within you begins to change position. Before, the observer hovered at the edge, watching life as a sequence of events to manage, evaluate, and defend against. Now, the observer moves toward the center. It no longer perceives everything as a potential threat, but as neutral data. When this happens, you may notice that you are less drawn into drama. Situations that once kept you awake no longer dominate your inner space, not because you no longer care, but because you no longer define yourself through external fluctuations. This is the sign that coherence is reinforcing itself. A consistent system does not need to react to everything to prove it exists. It only needs to be present with clarity, and that presence begins with silence. Silence is not avoidance, it is the condition for listening. As the noise fades, you begin to hear very subtle signals from within, delicate sensations about what should be kept and what must be released. You do not need lists, you do not need long analysis. You simply know, in a very simple way, that some things cannot continue with you any longer. And that knowing does not carry sharp pain, it carries acceptance. This is the foundation of coherence, not fighting the old, but no longer investing energy to keep it standing. In the language of quantum keys, coherence is the state in which the system no longer contradicts itself. When there is no inner argument, the outer world begins to respond differently. But before any clear response from reality appears, there is always a period of silence. This silence frightens many people because they are used to measuring progress through results. But coherence is not measured by outcomes. It is measured by stability. And stability cannot be rushed. If you are in this phase, you may feel as though you are standing in a neutral space, no longer pulled strongly forward and no longer dragged backward. This is not stagnation. It is a temporary balance point before the system selects a new configuration. The most important thing now is not what to do next, but not to disrupt the silence that has just formed. Each time you rush back into old patterns to reclaim a sense of familiarity, you create noise. Each time you tell yourself that you must quickly return to your previous level of activity, you interfere with the natural synchronization process. Coherence does not survive pressure. It only grows when it is allowed to exist without interruption. And this is a subtle but crucial truth. Reality begins to read you only when you stop constantly editing yourself. When you stop trying to become a version that is easy to accept, easy to explain, easy to predict. When you allow your inner system to rediscover its own rhythm, even if that rhythm is initially very slow. Most major turning points in a human life do not begin with decisions. They begin with silence that lasts long enough for a new decision to form without being distorted by the weight of the past. This is that phase. Coherence is being laid as a foundation. No bright lights, no declarations, only a quiet stability that is gradually emerging, enough for your system to become more consistent with each passing day. And when that consistency becomes deep enough, the changes that follow will not need to be forced. They will unfold as the natural consequence of a state that has already shifted. This is why Quantum Keys emphasizes silence before movement, because every new configuration of reality is born from a very still point. And if you feel yourself standing within that stillness, there is no need to worry. You are not stuck. You are being aligned. There is a very specific moment in this journey when you begin to realize that what is happening inside you no longer lives on the surface. It is not clear thoughts, not decisions you can easily name, but deeper movements, quieter ones, sometimes confusing because you cannot explain them in any simple way. This is when many people believe they are moving backward, that they have become overly sensitive, that old emotions and reactions they thought were long resolved are suddenly returning. But in the language of Quantum Keys, this is not regression. This is the moment when compressed energy begins to release. And for that release to happen, what was once pushed into the dark must be allowed to rise into awareness. This part of the journey often makes people want to turn back because it forces you to face states you have learned to avoid. Emotions that do not look good, memories that feel incomplete, reactions that make you wonder why you are like this at all. Yet this is precisely where the shadow begins to move. The shadow is not the bad part of you. The shadow is made of parts that were once necessary for survival, but are no longer aligned with your current state. They exist as trapped energy in the nervous system, in emotional memory, in automatic reflexes formed very early in life. When coherence begins to form, when your inner system becomes more stable, Those trapped energies are no longer held down as tightly. They look for a way out. And the only way they can be released is by passing through your awareness. That is why, during this phase, you may find yourself reacting strongly to very small things. A delayed reply to a message, a careless sentence, a change of plans. These reactions do not belong to the present moment. They are echoes from much earlier times, when you felt unsafe, unseen, or unheld. The shadow does not return to hurt you again. It returns because, for the first time, your system is safe enough to face it. This is an important paradox. Only when you are no longer in real danger can old danger memories surface. Only when you no longer need constant defense can old protective layers begin to dissolve. And this often happens quietly, without any clear script. You simply notice that there are days when you feel more tired than usual, more emotionally open, more easily touched by unnamed feelings. If you are here, if you are listening to these words and feel a subtle vibration in your chest, as if something familiar is being named, I want to ask you one simple but very real question. Are you experiencing emotions that logic cannot explain? Have you ever wondered why you react this way? Why small things reach so deeply, even though you know you have grown so much? If that question touches you, if you feel that you are not entirely alone in this state, you can leave one word in the comments. Just one word, no explanation needed. One word to mark that you are here, that you are present with this journey. Not to prove anything, but to let me know that what I am sharing is not falling into empty space. Your presence, even through a single small word, is truly precious to someone who creates content like this. And I want to say thank you, sincerely, with deep gratitude, for staying long enough to reach this part. Returning to the journey, the most important thing in the phase where the shadow rises is not understanding it, but allowing it to exist without judgment. Each time you try to suppress an emotion because you believe it should not appear, you compress that energy back into the system. And compressed energy does not disappear. It simply waits for another moment to erupt with greater force. But when you allow yourself to feel without identifying, when you observe without self-blame, something very unusual happens. The emotion begins to move. It no longer sits like a solid block in your chest or your abdomen. It gains flow. And when energy flows, it no longer controls you. Neuroscience explains this clearly. When you avoid an emotion, the amygdala keeps the nervous system in a state of alert. But when you consciously recognize that emotion, the prefrontal cortex becomes involved, sending signals of safety throughout the system. The heart rate slows, the body relaxes, trapped energy is allowed to release. This is not magic, this is biology. And Jung saw this very early when he said that light does not come from imagining beautiful images, but from making the darkness conscious. The shadow does not need to be eliminated, it needs to be seen. When it is seen, it loses its power to control. Many people emerge from this phase with a very unusual feeling. Not intense happiness, but lightness. Lightness from no longer having to grip what has grown too heavy. Lightness from realizing that reactions once felt shameful were simply traces of a system that tried to protect itself. And from that understanding, a natural compassion appears, not first for others, but for oneself. This is the true gift of the shadow. It does not destroy you. It frees you from unconscious contracts with the past. If you are in this phase, if you feel old emotions knocking at the door, do not rush to close it. You do not need to dig or analyze. You only need enough presence to not run away. That is enough for the energy to begin moving. And when energy is released, the inner space becomes wider. In that space, new structures will begin to form. But that is the story of the next part. For now, simply know this: if you feel things rising, if you feel more sensitive, more real, more vulnerable, You are not wrong. You are moving in the right direction. And I am deeply grateful that you are here, that you are listening, and that your presence makes this journey meaningful. After the shadow has been seen and trapped, energy begins to release. A very subtle yet very deep change takes place inside you. It is not loud, it does not seek attention, and it is often only recognized in hindsight. This is the phase of inner power restructuring, when your internal system no longer operates through old reflexes and starts reorganizing itself into a different order. You no longer feel the need to try to be strong, because strength no longer comes from tension, it comes from stability. This stability is not emotional control, it is the moment when emotions no longer control you. Before, an unexpected situation could keep you tense for an entire day. A careless remark could trap you in hours of overthinking. Someone's silence could pull you back into very old fears. Now you begin to notice a small pause emerging between stimulus and response. That pause is the clearest sign of restructuring. Within that pause, you no longer react automatically. You observe, and that act of observation alone changes the way your nervous system operates. This is when your internal baseline shifts, not because you learned a new skill, but because your system is no longer locked in constant survival mode. When the shadow is released, large amounts of energy once used for defense become free. That energy does not disappear. It is redistributed, and where it goes is into presence. You may notice yourself becoming calmer in situations that once made you anxious, not because you became numb, but because you are no longer pulled into old scripts. This is a very different kind of maturity than what people usually imagine. It does not make you sharper through confrontation. It makes you steadier without the need to confront. In the language of quantum keys, this is when coherence enters the nervous system. When coherence forms at the biological level, the entire reaction system is rewritten. You no longer need to remind yourself to stay calm. Calm becomes your baseline. You no longer need constant self-reassurance. Safety is felt from within. This explains why many people in this phase feel slower to react, not because they lost sharpness, but because they are no longer driven by unconscious fear. This slowing down is essential. It allows choice, and choice is always the signature of inner power. When you are no longer ruled by reflex, you begin acting from a deeper layer. Your decisions become simpler, not because life has fewer complexities, but because you no longer need to calculate endlessly to protect image, role, or approval. You say no without long explanations. You step away from situations that do not fit without carrying guilt. You choose silence when silence is self-respect. This is not selfishness. It is the sign that the ego has stepped aside for the self. When the ego dominates, every action carries tension. It must be right. It must win. It must be recognized. But when the self leads, action becomes clean. You do not need to prove. You do not need to persuade. You do not need to pull others along. You only need to stand in the correct inner position. From that position, many things fall into place naturally. What is interesting is that this restructuring often goes unnoticed by others at first. Externally, you may not look very different, but internally, you know that a new order is operating. You are no longer pulled into familiar loops. Old stories lose their grip. Relationships built on tension become harder to sustain, not because you reject them, but because your system no longer resonates with them. In this phase, many people are surprised to realize they are no longer trying to change themselves. The change already happened earlier, in silence, in facing the shadow, in allowing energy to move. Now you are simply living from that new structure. Like a river after ice has melted, it does not try to flow harder. It simply follows the new terrain that has opened. This is why Quantum Keys emphasizes that real inner power does not come from forcing yourself forward, but from stopping the habit of pulling yourself back into the past. When old attachments are released, the system naturally moves toward a more efficient configuration, and that configuration always consumes less energy. You feel lighter, not because all problems are gone, but because you no longer carry them in the old way. You handle what needs to be handled, then you let it go. No storing, no replaying, no rebuilding stories in your mind. This is the clear sign that inner power has been restructured. A power not built on tension, a power that does not need proof. A power stable enough to remain unmoved by small disturbances. And from this state, something very natural happens. You begin to feel no need to be everywhere, no need to join every conversation, no need to answer every call. This does not come from fatigue, it comes from discernment. Your system has learned how to preserve energy. And when energy is preserved, it begins to accumulate. That accumulation does not show itself immediately. It prepares you for another phase, deeper and quieter. But before entering that phase, what matters is recognizing that inner restructuring has already occurred. You are no longer the person reacting out of habit. You are operating from a different order, and that order does not need to be announced. It only needs to be lived. This is the foundation for the next steps to unfold, not through effort, but through synchronization. And if you sense this change, however subtle and quiet, trust that it is real. Because the deepest transformations always happen in silence and are only confirmed when you realize you are no longer standing where you once were. After inner power has been restructured and the internal system has found a new order, a change appears that is often misunderstood. You no longer want to show up as much as before. You no longer feel the need to explain, to share, to participate. Conversations that once made you feel you belonged now feel heavy. Places that once felt familiar no longer pull you in. Not because you reject people or the world around you, but because your energy is being drawn into a deeper layer. This is a ceremonial withdrawal phase, not an escape, not isolation, but a gathering of force. In the language of quantum keys, this is when the field contracts to prepare for a stronger expansion. All living systems move this way. Before an eruption, energy always pulls inward. Before a major movement, there is always a still interval. You may notice that you prefer being alone, quiet evenings, uninterrupted moments, not because you are sad, but because you can hear your inner voice more clearly. And when that voice becomes clear, other noises begin to feel unnecessary. This is when many people around you do not understand you. They may think you have changed, that you have grown distant, that you have become cold. The truth is that you are no longer dispersing energy to maintain connections that no longer resonate. Your system has learned to prioritize inner coherence over external approval. Withdrawal in this phase does not carry loneliness. It carries preparation. As if something is being rearranged at a deep level and you need space for it to complete itself. Only in silence can the final layers of noise settle. And only when noise settles can the signal be refined. Many people fear this phase because they are used to measuring self-worth through interaction, visibility, response, and validation. But once you have moved through inner restructuring, you no longer need those anchors to feel that you exist. You begin to feel safe within your own presence. And from that safety, the need to withdraw arises naturally. There is no major decision, no clear declaration, only a gentle inward movement, like a tide quietly changing direction. In this phase, you may speak less, not because you have nothing to say, but because you no longer feel the need to say everything. You may respond more slowly, not because you are indifferent, but because you are no longer reacting under pressure. You begin to choose more carefully where you place your attention, and that discernment does not feel like lack. It feels like clarity. This is when energy begins to accumulate, not to erupt immediately, but to regenerate. Quantum Keys calls this the field accumulation phase. When you step away from noise, the inner field gains space to reorganize itself. New thoughts begin to appear, not as excitement, but as certainty. New directions do not yet have clear form, but you feel their pull. And what matters is that you do not rush. You do not need to turn these sensations into plans yet, because you understand that anything born from noise cannot last. You are learning to trust your own rhythm. This is a deep learning not to show up when it is not needed, learning not to respond when response does not come from inner truth, learning to stay within the gap without filling it with action. And within that gap, new structures begin to form. Many who have passed through this phase describe it as a sense of charging, not excited energy, but condensed energy. You may feel that you are carrying more, even though nothing outside has changed. You do not need to prove this to anyone. You do not need to fully understand it. You simply know that something is being prepared. The history of major transformations always carries traces of such withdrawal, periods that are misunderstood, labeled as drifting, judged as disconnection. Yet these are the periods where real strength is built. Jung withdrew from the world for years to confront his own unconscious. From the outside, nothing remarkable seemed to happen, but within, an entirely new foundation was being laid. This is true for all deep transformations. No true return happens without a phase of inward retreat for rebirth. And the most subtle truth is this: this phase cannot be forced. If you try to withdraw before the system is ready, it becomes avoidance. But when withdrawal arises naturally, it carries peace. You are not running from life. You are leaving forms of living that no longer match your new frequency. You still work. You still meet essential responsibilities, but you no longer invest emotion in what does not nourish you. This difference is profound. Ceremonial withdrawal is not abandoning life, it is refining it. You keep what is essential, you release what is excess, and in doing so, your field becomes cleaner. When the field is clean, future responses from reality become more precise. This is why this phase must be respected. If you rush back to old rhythms just to feel that you still belong, you dilute the energy being gathered. If you force yourself to socialize, to appear, to maintain an image, you interrupt regeneration. But if you allow yourself to rest within this withdrawal, without judgment, without explanation, without pressure, something very natural happens. When energy is full, it finds its own way outward. You do not need to push it. You do not need to plan it. And when it moves outward, it will do so in a form entirely different from before. That is the story of the next part. For now, what matters most is recognizing that this withdrawal is not a sign of loss, but a ceremonial preparation. You are not disappearing from the world. You are stepping away from old frequencies so you can stand more firmly in the new one. And if you are in this phase, if you feel quieter, more selective, less in need of explanation, trust that it is right. Because every deep return requires a long enough retreat for true strength to be formed in silence. After the phase of withdrawal and silent energy accumulation, something very particular begins to happen. Not loudly, not dramatically, not in the form of a miracle. Reality starts responding to you with a precision that quietly stops you and makes you wonder why things align so exactly. This is the phase where the signals of a comeback begin to appear. In the language of quantum keys, this is not the universe sending signs to comfort you. It is the external field reflecting an internal state that has become stable enough. When energy has been gathered, when the system is no longer scattered, reality no longer needs to respond randomly. It responds with accuracy. You may notice very small things arriving at exactly the right time. A sentence you happen to hear when you need it most. A book you touch, opening to the precise page that answers a question you had not yet put into words. A person appearing neither too early nor too late, carrying a piece you thought you had lost. These coincidences do not feel exciting, they feel confirming, as if something calm is telling you that you are moving in the right rhythm. Jung called this synchronicity, but quantum keys goes one step further. Synchronicity is not magic, it is feedback. It appears when your inner system has reached enough coherence that the outer world no longer needs to respond through noise. When the inside is conflicted, reality responds with repetition, endless challenges, loops that pull you back again and again. But when conflict settles, when you stop pulling in opposite directions, reality begins to simplify. Not easier in the sense of avoiding difficulty, but clearer. You know where to go. You know what to say. And when you move from that clarity, doors open without being pushed. What matters is that synchronicity does not appear while you are still trying to control everything. It only emerges when you have released enough to stop interfering with the natural rhythm of the system. Many people miss this phase because they continue to view reality through an old lens. They believe things must be difficult to be valuable. They grow suspicious when something arrives too smoothly. But that suspicion is simply residue from the old state. When you have withdrawn long enough, when inner power has been restructured, when the inner field has become consistent, ease is no longer something to doubt. It is a consequence. A stable system always creates a smoother flow. In this phase, you may notice that you are no longer searching for signs. You are no longer asking whether you are on the right path. Signals arrive naturally, without being requested. And what is interesting is that they usually come in very ordinary forms. No lights, no grand messages, just small pieces arranging themselves logically. You think of something and a few hours later it appears. You release an old direction and shortly after a new one opens. Not because you are being rewarded, but because the system is no longer in conflict. This is where many people confuse synchronicity with desire. Desire creates tension. Synchronicity appears when tension is gone. Desire demands. Synchronicity confirms. You do not need to believe in anything for it to happen. You only need not to block it. And the only way not to block it is to maintain the stable state you have already built. This requires great subtlety, because when the first alignments begin to appear, the old ego may want to return and take control. It wants to declare success, to claim credit, to prove worth. But the moment ego steps in, coherence is disrupted. Synchronicity cannot survive in self-importance. It needs neutrality. It needs an observer that does not interfere. That is why this phase is not about announcing or explaining too much. It is about continuing to observe, observing how reality responds, observing how you respond to ease. You may notice that you act more naturally, hesitate less, analyze less, not because you are careless, but because you are no longer resisting the flow. Decisions made from this state feel clean. You are not torn. You do not need to convince yourself. And strangely, those decisions often lead to outcomes that fit, even if they do not look like victories at first. This is a key feature of the signal phase. What arrives does not always match your old image of success, but it always matches your current state. You are no longer guided by desire, but by alignment. And alignment carries a deep sense of calm, even when there is nothing yet to celebrate externally. Many people say that during this phase, they reconnect with old people in completely new contexts, or they meet new people who feel strangely familiar, not because of destiny or past lives, but because their field has changed. When the field changes, what no longer resonates leaves on its own, and what aligns appears naturally. No effort, no arrangement. This is how reality optimizes itself. when it is no longer distorted by inner conflict. And if you are in this phase, if you see pieces quietly falling into place, small and ordinary, pay attention, not to cling, but to recognize. Recognize that you have shifted into a different rhythm. Recognize that what you did in silence before was not meaningless. It created the conditions for reality to respond with clarity. This is the signal of a comeback, not applause, but precision. Not explosion, but alignment. And once you see this, you stop asking when your life will change. It already has, because life does not change when everything looks different. Life changes when reality begins answering you without requiring you to shout. And from that moment on, you move into the next phase where you no longer wait for validation from outside, because you have become the anchor around which things naturally turn. There is a moment that is difficult to name when you begin to realize that you are no longer standing where you once were, even though nothing outside has visibly changed yet. This is the tipping point of the comeback journey. Not an explosion, not a major event, but a deep shift that has already completed itself before life has time to change form. You no longer wait for something to happen in order to feel ready. You are no longer living in preparation mode. There is a clear sense that a threshold has been crossed, even if no one around you notices, and sometimes even you cannot point to the exact moment it occurred. This is the nature of a tipping point. It does not arrive with noise. It arrives as a change in inner identity. You begin to act from a different place, not from fear, not from defense, not from the need to prove. You act from a deep stability, as if your internal system has locked into a new configuration and cannot return to the old one. What matters is that the tipping point is not a reward for effort. It is the result of silent accumulation. Everything you went through before, the quiet days, the moments of facing the shadow,